By the morning of September 8, 1860, the beaches of Winnetka were already crowded. Word had spread fast that something had gone wrong out on Lake Michigan, and hundreds of people came running to the shoreline to see if there was anything they could do. What they found was heads bobbing in the water, voices screaming past the breakers, and wreckage washing in with every wave, and it was already clear that most of it was too late. Some survivors had managed to grab hold of broken planks and pieces of the upper deck and were riding the waves close enough to shore that the people on the beach could see their faces clearly. Then the undertow pulled them back under in full view of everyone standing there, while rescuers wading in couldn't close the last few yards between them. What had gone down out there was the sidewheel steamer Lady Elgin, and she had taken around 300 people with her, most of them from one Irish community in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. To this day, it remains the deadliest open water disaster in the history of the Great Lakes. But what makes this more than just a shipwreck is the world it happened in, a country days away from the most divisive presidential election in its history, with Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas tearing the nation apart over slavery and the people on that ship caught right in the middle of it. Whether what happened that night was a terrible accident or something with darker fingerprints on it is exactly what we're here to find out. This is One Wave Away. Before we get into the night everything fell apart, here's the quick version of what the Lady Elgin actually was. Built in 1851 in Buffalo, New York, at a cost of $95,000, roughly $3.5 million in today's money, she ran 252 feet long and displaced over 1,000 tons, making her one of the largest vessels on the Great Lakes at the time. The Sheboygan Mercury described her staterooms as finished with the richest draperies arranged in sweeping curves that reminded passengers of ancient Eastern palaces, and the rest of the ship matched that standard, a grand staircase leading up from the main lobby to the hurricane deck, a central salon ringed by private cabins, separate lounges for men and women, a smoking room. She ran the route between Lake Superior and the ports of Wisconsin and Illinois, carrying passengers and cargo both, and her arrivals were occasions worth noting. Just days before her final voyage, the Chicago Tribune reported she'd pulled into St. Joseph, Michigan, decked with flags and adorned with evergreens in a welcome the paper said would long be remembered. The ship's engine and boilers, though, had a history that didn't quite match the elegance of the rest of her. They'd been salvaged from a vessel called the Cleopatra, an ocean-going slave trader seized by the US Navy, and the people who knew about it tended not to forget it. Whether the Cleopatra's past had anything to do with it is a matter of what you believe. But the Lady Elgin's accident record was hard to ignore. Regardless, she struck a rock off Manitowoc in 1854 and partially sank, had a machinery failure serious enough to require towing the following year, caught fire in 1857, ran aground twice in 1858, and snapped her crankshaft in 1859. 9 years of service, and she'd managed to collect nearly every variety of maritime disaster short of actually going to the bottom. That last one was still ahead of her. Now set that ship against the backdrop of 1860 America, and you start to see why this story goes well beyond a maritime accident. The slavery debate had been grinding for decades, but by 1860, it had sharpened into something with real daily consequences: the Fugitive Slave Act. It was legally requiring northern citizens to assist in capturing and returning escaped slaves, which had turned a distant political argument into something people in Ohio and Wisconsin and Illinois were being personally dragged into. 8 seconds / greater than Wisconsin's Governor Alexander Randall was so opposed to the pro-slavery faction that he was openly floating the idea of the state leaving the Union entirely if Stephen Douglas, who supported letting each territory decide the slavery question for itself, won the presidency. The Union Guards of Milwaukee's Irish Third Ward sat squarely on the other side of that argument. They were Irish-American Democrats, they backed Douglas, and they had no interest in Randall's secession plans, which they considered closer to treason than principle. Randall responded by ordering the unit disbanded and having their weapons and uniforms confiscated, a calculated public humiliation for a group whose entire identity was bound up in that militia, and the kind of move that doesn't get forgotten quietly. Their response was the Lady Elgin excursion, a $1 a ticket fundraiser to Chicago, with the explicit goal of raising enough money to buy 80 new muskets from a St. Louis supplier at $2 apiece and rearm themselves without the governor's blessing. On the morning of September the 6th, they boarded in Milwaukee the guards and their families, city officials, 2 German militia units, the Milwaukee City Band, and spent the following day in Chicago at political rallies. And by the evening of September the 7th, they were back on the ship with the band playing on the upper deck and the saloon full of people who'd had a long good day and were ready to be home. What happened next is where this story gets dark. September 7th, 1860, started the way good days do with people looking forward to something. The Union Guards and their families had arrived in Chicago the previous morning, and the city gave them a full day of it. Parades through the streets, political speeches, a stop at McVicker's Theatre, and for the Irish immigrants among them, a cyclorama, a 360-degree panoramic painting of Ireland that reportedly moved grown men to tears. They'd also gotten their hands on the muskets they came for and paraded through Chicago's streets carrying them, which must have felt like a small victory after everything Randall had put them through. Stephen Douglas himself never showed there was some delay, some excuse, and the headliner they'd traveled to here simply wasn't there. But by evening, it didn't seem to matter much. By 10 o'clock, they were back on the Lady Elgin. The German brass band was playing in the main saloon, and the dance floor was full. Whatever frustration the day had brought, the ride home was washing it away, or so it seemed. What most of the passengers didn't know was that the ship was significantly overloaded. The official count put the number on board at around 400, but survivor accounts and later estimates suggest the real figure was closer to 500 or 600 people were sleeping in the aisles on the floors on spare chairs, and younger men had found their way down into the cargo hold to sleep on sacks of flour and feed grain. And what almost none of them knew was that Captain Jack Wilson had already looked at the barometer before departure and didn't like what he saw. Wilson had actually pushed back against leaving that night. The weather signs were bad enough that he'd suggested waiting, but the passengers were day trippers. They had jobs, families, lives back in Milwaukee, and they pushed back harder. One survivor, Margaret Burke, later recalled that she had begged her husband to take the train home, instead that she had a feeling she couldn't explain, and that he had argued her out of it. The Lady Elgin left Chicago at 11:30 in the evening, headed north into whatever the lake had waiting. For the first hour or so, it was manageable. Then the storm hit properly, a full northwesterly gale with driving rain, lightning, and waves that survivors later described as running over 20 feet. Most passengers retreated below deck. The band kept playing for those who stayed, and the ship pushed on through it because that's what ships did, and that's what captains were paid to decide. Captain Wilson turned the bow directly into the wind and held his course, and by most accounts he was handling the storm well enough. The problem wasn't the storm. The problem was the Augusta, a two-masted lumber schooner under the command of Captain Darius Mallett, running south toward Chicago with a heavy load of timber out of Port Huron. She was moving at around 11 knots, which was fast for those conditions, and she was carrying only a single white light mounted on her bow, not the running lights that would have made her visible from a distance in a storm. The Augusta's second mate had spotted the Lady Elgin's lights 30 minutes before the collision. He watched them for 20 minutes before saying anything to anyone. By the time Mallett ordered the wheel put hard over, the Augusta was already too close and moving too fast, and she didn't answer her rudder the way he expected heavily loaded ships in gale-force winds rarely do. At 2:30 in the morning of September 8th, the Augusta drove straight into the port side of the Lady Elgin, just forward of the paddle wheel at full speed. The jib boom of the Augusta punched through the Lady Elgin's hull and into her provisions store. Witnesses on the Augusta later described dishes and cookware from the Lady Elgin's galleys scattering across their own deck. For a few seconds, the two ships were locked together close enough that a person could have stepped from one to the other before a wave separated them. On the Lady Elgin, every chandelier in the ship shattered on impact, plunging the passengers into complete darkness. A surviving crew member later wrote that he walked past the cabins in those first seconds and saw the women inside pale, motionless, silent, with no cry and no shriek, just the sound of escaping steam and rushing water. On the Augusta, Mallett assessed his own damage, decided his ship was in worse shape than the steamer, and seeing no obvious sign of distress from the Lady Elgin in the dark, and the rain turned and continued toward Chicago. He would not learn the full scale of what he'd done until his ship limped into port the following morning. Captain Wilson came up from below to find water already filling the engine room. Passenger John Everston ran to the side of the ship, looked at the hole, and reportedly said, "My God, that hole is large enough to drive a carriage and horse through." Wilson knew the ship was 9 miles from the Winnetka shoreline and immediately tried to run her toward shallow water. He ordered passengers shifted to the starboard side to list the ship and raise the hole above the waterline, then ordered somewhere between 100 and 150 head of cattle, which had been carried as ballast in the lower hold, driven overboard to lighten the load. What followed was one of the more disturbing images from the entire disaster survivors later described. People, non-swimmers, desperate with nothing else to grab, trying to climb onto the backs of the cattle thrashing in the water around the ship and being pulled under with them when the animals went down. Below deck, the ship's steward had gone into the coal bunker and was trying to stuff mattresses into the breech. A passenger described him still working at it as the water rose around his waist. The lifeboats were not going to save anyone. There were only a few on board, and when the crew attempted to lower one to assess the damage, it was swept away immediately by the sea and never returned. Another had no oars, or only one accounts differ, making it useless in those conditions. Wilson ordered the crew to tear apart anything that could serve as a flotation device, railings, doors, sections of decking, and distribute the ship's wooden life preservers, which were 5-foot planks barely 2 inches thick and not designed for open water in a gale. 20 minutes after the collision, the water flooding the engine room extinguished the boiler fires and the engines stopped. Without power, the ship couldn't be steered toward shore, and she began to drift. Then the boilers and the engine massive iron structures, weighing many tons, broke loose from their mounts and punched straight through the weakened hull. The air trapped in the ship's hollow superstructure had nowhere to go, and the upper decks blew apart with a force that survivors compared to an explosion. The Lady Elgin broke in two. The heavy stern section with its machinery went down fast, pulling everyone near it under, while the bow section and the detached upper deck stayed afloat a little longer, giving the people clinging to them a few more minutes. A surviving sailor named Fred Codemeyer described being sucked into the ship as she went down, carried by the rushing water through machinery spaces, convinced he was going to die inside the hull before somehow finding a piece of wreckage to grab and fighting his way back to the surface. When the Lady Elgin finally disappeared, what was left on the surface was wreckage, 300 feet of dark water underneath it, and in the flashes of lightning between the waves, hundreds of heads. Prayers and curses in equal measure, survivors said, rose from the water in the dark. Some people were singing hymns, some were calling out names. The German band's instruments were somewhere in the wreckage. Just an hour earlier, they'd been playing waltzes in the saloon, and now the only sound carrying across the water between the thunder was the sound of people trying to stay alive long enough for the shore to find them. The shore was 9 miles away, and the lake was not done with them yet. While the wreckage was still spreading across the surface of Lake Michigan, the people on the Winnetka shoreline were learning a brutal lesson about the difference between watching someone drown and actually being able to stop it. The undertow that ran along that stretch of beach was strong enough to pull experienced swimmers off their feet, and rescuers who waded in found themselves in trouble within seconds. Most of the crowd could do nothing but stand there and watch, which is its own kind of damage. But not everyone stood still. Edward Spencer was a 26-year-old theology student at Garrett Biblical Institute, which sat just a short distance from the lake on what is now the Northwestern University campus in Evanston. He was known as a strong swimmer, and when he reached the beach that morning and saw what was happening, he didn't spend much time weighing his options. He tied a rope around his waist, handed the other end to his brother and a group of men on shore who would pull him back in, and walked into the water. Over the next 6 hours, Spencer went in 16 times. Each time, the men on shore pulled the rope and dragged him back through the breakers with whoever he'd managed to reach. Between rescues, he would sit by a fire, catch his breath, and go back in, cut up from the wreckage in the surf, exhausted past the point most people would have stopped, but going back in regardless. On his last run, with almost nothing left in him, he pulled both James Everston and his wife to safety at the same time, and then collapsed on the sand and didn't get up. When Spencer came around, the first thing he said, and kept saying through what witnesses described as a state of delirium that lasted for hours, was, "Did I do my best, fellows? Tell me, did I do my best? Sid." 17 people were alive on that beach because of him. The injuries he sustained that morning left him a semi-invalid for the rest of his life, and he never completed his theology degree or became the minister he'd set out to be. Northwestern University eventually awarded him an honorary degree in 1909, nearly 50 years later, and a bronze plaque in his honor still sits on that campus today. A quiet answer to the question he kept asking on the sand. Out on the water, Captain Jack Wilson had managed to get a large section of the ship's upper deck working as a makeshift raft, and somewhere around 50 people were clinging to it with him. For hours he held them together, not just physically, but in the way that matters more when people are close to giving up. And at one point he was seen cradling a small child in his arms to keep the mother from letting go of the raft. His last recorded words as the raft was being driven toward the rocks near shore were, "Now, boys, look out for the breakers ahead." The raft broke apart on a sandbar just short of the beach. Wilson made it into shallow water and then heard children screaming somewhere behind him in the surf. He turned around and went back in, and a wave drove a large piece of timber into him, and that was the end of it. His body was found 2 days later near Michigan City, carried there by the same currents that had taken so many others. The city of Milwaukee immediately set up a fundraising drive for his widow and children, and the newspapers of the time described him in terms usually reserved for men who die in battle, which in a way is exactly what he did. Then there was Charles Beverung, the bass drummer of the German band that had been playing waltzes in the saloon just an hour before the collision. When the ship broke apart and the lifeboats proved useless, Beverung did something that sounds almost too strange to be true. He cut one face off his large bass drum, climbed inside the shell, and used it as a one-man vessel, paddling with his hands through 12 miles of open lake in the middle of a gale until he reached the Winnetka shore without a scratch. Of all the things that washed up on that beach on the morning of September 8th, a man floating to safety inside a drum must have been one of the stranger sights. But by that point, the people standing there had already seen enough that very little could surprise them. There were others. Jacob Conrad, a Winnetka resident, pulled at least 6 people from the surf before the undertow dragged him under, and bystanders had to haul him out with a rope and revive him on the beach. Families like the Gage and Carter households opened their doors and turned their homes into emergency wards, taking in survivors who had arrived on shore with no clothes. The waves had stripped many of them of everything, and no idea whether anyone they'd come with was still alive. The Winnetka train depot, which had only recently been built, was converted into a temporary morgue. When the Augusta limped into Chicago Harbor on the morning of September 8th, her bow was smashed and her headgear was gone, and Captain Darius Mallett reported the collision to the harbormaster as if it were a routine incident, something he'd bumped into in the dark, nothing more. By 8 o'clock that same morning, news of the Lady Elgin disaster was filling the streets of Chicago. The crowd that gathered at the dock when the Augusta's role became known was angry enough that Mallett reportedly needed protection to leave the waterfront without being attacked. Mallott was arrested, tried in Chicago, and acquitted, and the legal reasoning behind that acquittal tells you everything about why the disaster happened in the first place. The judgment rested on two pillars. Maritime law at the time gave sailing vessels the right of way over steam-powered ships, and critically, there was no legal requirement for sailing vessels to carry running lights at night. A subsequent investigation found that the entire collision could have been prevented by a $15 lantern. The coroner's jury didn't go after Mallott. They went after his second mate, a man named Budge, whom they declared incompetent for watching the Lady Elgin's lights for 20 minutes and saying nothing. 4 years later, in 1864, a new ruling finally required all sailing vessels on the Great Lakes to carry running lights. It had taken 300 lives to produce a regulation worth $15. As for the Augusta herself, public contempt for the ship ran so deep that she was repainted and renamed the Colonel Cook to escape the stigma. Sailors regarded her as a hoodoo ship, and crews were reportedly difficult to sign on. She eventually ran aground and broke apart on a Lake Erie shoal in 1894, 34 years after the collision, and by most accounts, the lake took its time, but got there eventually. Then there's Mallott himself. In 1864, 4 years after the Lady Elgin disaster, he took command of a Lake Michigan vessel called the Mojave. The Mojave sank with all hands, including Mallott, in a storm close to the same waters where the Lady Elgin went down. The date was September 8, 1864. The 4th anniversary of the collision to the day. It was also Mallott's 31st birthday. Whether that's poetic justice or just the lake being the lake is something you'll have to decide for yourself. Now, was the Lady Elgin deliberately sunk? That's the question that has followed this story for over 160 years. And the honest answer is that nobody knows, and the evidence cuts both ways. The case for conspiracy starts with the politics, which we've already covered. The Union Guards were the most organized Democratic militia in Milwaukee. They had publicly humiliated Governor Randall by refusing to support his plans, and they were on that ship specifically because he'd stripped them of their weapons. The people who wanted them politically neutralized had motive. The Augusta's behavior that night also raised questions that were never fully resolved. Her second mate saw the Lady Elgin's lights for 30 minutes and gave no order. When Mallott finally did act, he steered to the wrong side toward the steamer rather than away, in a maneuver that conflicted with standard maritime practice. And after the collision, instead of attempting any kind of assistance, the Augusta simply sailed away. None of that is proof of anything. Negligence explains all of it just as well as malice does, and the storm conditions that night were severe enough that confusion and poor judgment were entirely plausible. What is beyond dispute is what the disaster did to Milwaukee's Irish community. Nearly every political and civic leader from the Third Ward was on that ship, and most of them didn't come back. Historians have noted that the sinking directly contributed to shifting the balance of political power in Milwaukee from the Irish community to the German community, a shift that reshaped the city's identity for generations. Whether that outcome was engineered or accidental, the effect was the same. The Union Guards were gone. Their weapons were on the bottom of the lake, where divers would later find muskets and swords still lying in the wreckage, and the political force they represented in Milwaukee simply ceased to exist. The conspiracy theory has never been proven, and most serious historians treat it as exactly that, a theory shaped by the circumstances rather than supported by direct evidence. But in a year when the country was coming apart at the seams, when governors were planning secession and militias were choosing sides, and when a single lumber schooner with no lights and a second mate who waited 30 minutes to speak up managed to kill 300 people and wipe out an entire political community in one night, the idea that it might not have been an accident is the kind of question that a place like Lake Michigan doesn't give you the luxury of answering cleanly. In the weeks after the disaster, bodies washed ashore along Lake Michigan's Illinois coast for months, as far south as Whiting, Indiana, carried there by the same currents that had denied so many people the shore they could almost see. Those that couldn't be identified were buried in a mass grave in Winnetka. Others were transported back to Milwaukee, where the city was trying to absorb what had happened to it. Early newspaper reports claimed more than 1,000 children had been orphaned by the disaster. Later genealogical research put the real figure at fewer than 40 who had lost both parents. But the number almost doesn't matter when you consider what the Third Ward had actually lost. Not just fathers and mothers, but nearly its entire generation of civic and political leadership gone in a single night. Among the roughly 300 who died was Herbert Ingram, founder of the Illustrated London News, a member of the British Parliament, and by most accounts the wealthiest and most prominent individual ever to perish in a Great Lakes shipwreck. He and his son had been the only foreign nationals on board. A statue of Ingram still stands in the city centre of Boston, Lincolnshire, England. The town he represented in Parliament, erected in 1862, 2 years after the lake took him. It's one of the few physical memorials to the Lady Elgin that exists anywhere outside of the United States. The Lady Elgin herself stayed on the bottom for 129 years. In 1989, a commercial diver from Chicago named Harry Zeich found her after 16 years of searching 4 debris fields spread across the lake floor off Highland Park, Illinois, lying in 50 to 60 feet of water. What he found inside included china silverware, nautical instruments, firearms, and the ship's safe, which still held 2 gold pocket watches and 70 gold and silver coins that passengers had entrusted to the purser for safekeeping on what they expected to be a routine overnight voyage. Zeich claimed ownership of the wreck under a century-old admiralty law, and the state of Illinois said no setting off a legal battle that would run for a full decade. The state argued that the lakebed belonged to Illinois. Zeich argued that the ship had never been formally abandoned since the insurance company that paid out after the sinking in 1860 had never officially surrendered their claim to the vessel. In 1999, the court sided with Zeich, and he was awarded legal ownership, making the Lady Elgin one of the very few Great Lakes wrecks in private hands. The wreck site today requires permission from the Lady Elgin Foundation to dive, and most of the loose artifacts have long since been removed. Among the artifacts recovered was a gold pocket watch, 18 carats, with the initials H.I. engraved on the case. It was identified as belonging to Herbert Ingram, the parliamentarian from Boston, Lincolnshire, and it had spent 132 years sitting on the bottom of Lake Michigan before a diver pulled it up in 1992. In 2025, 165 years after the night, it went under maritime historian Valerie Van Heest, arranged for the watch to be returned to Boston, Lincolnshire, where it now sits in the Boston Guildhall Museum. Some things, it turns out, find their way home. The Lady Elgin story doesn't end cleanly, because stories like this one never do. A country on the edge of its worst war, a ship full of people who had done nothing wrong except get caught in the middle of it. 300 lives lost to a $15 lantern that nobody was required to carry. And somewhere underneath all of that, a question about whether any of it was truly an accident that Lake Michigan has kept to itself for 165 years. The wreck is still out there off Highland Park in 50 feet of water. The muskets the Union Guards bought to rearm themselves are still down there too, lying in the silt alongside the china from the dining room and the coins from the purser's safe. And then there's Spencer's question, the one he kept asking on the beach while he was still barely conscious, the one that got engraved on a bronze plaque at Northwestern University and has been sitting there ever since. Did I do my best? In a story full of people who made the wrong call, a second mate, who waited too long, a captain who sailed away, a governor who let politics override judgment, it's the question of a man who had no power over any of it, who just showed up on a beach with a rope and kept going back in. Whatever the Lady Elgin was or wasn't, whatever happened out there on the lake that night, that question is the part of it that doesn't go away.